This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What the hell is going on?
What's really going on?
We said, what the hell happened?
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
They see what's going on. I don't know what's going on. What is going on?
We must find out what is going on.
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast. What the hell is going on? Mark, what the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on? Things are happening in the war in Ukraine. Donald Trump is talking about sending Tomahawk missiles, which would be a game changer in the war. And the Europeans have suddenly, after 3 years of resistance to this idea, have suddenly decided that maybe we should use the $300 some odd billion in Russian assets, the state assets that are frozen in European banks, and use those to help Ukraine buy weapons. Why is that, Danny? Well, maybe it's because the U.S. isn't using taxpayer dollars anymore, and is basically the Trump policy is Europe can buy the weapons and give them to Ukraine, and we'll sell them to you. And all of a sudden, they have a choice. Should we make our taxpayers pay for the Ukraine war, or should we let Putin do it? And so they're starting to come around to the idea maybe Putin should pay for the war, which I am perfectly fine with.
So I think this is actually a really, really important conversation that we haven't had, which is about conditioning behavior. So, look, I think that, Mark, people like you and me and sort of robust American internationalists who believe in the West, who believe in American global leadership, have always made the argument that, yeah, you know what? Our NATO allies suck, but the truth is that NATO is good for us even if they suck, and that our other allies suck. But these relationships are important for us because at the end of the day, a better world serves American interests, right? A world of democracy, a world where, of peace is one that is good for America, that has fueled American prosperity, that has fueled American leadership, that has fueled the rise of democracy and the rise of out of poverty of billions of people. And I think that that's a very, very valid argument. The problem is that we never asked ourselves what behavior we were conditioning in our allies. And of course, the answer is we were conditioning free riders, right? Like so
Yep.
much, you have 4 kids, I have 4 kids. So much is like parenthood. If you allow your kids to, it's true, Mark, and you know this
Yep.
too. And our listeners will say,
absolutely.
right. If you allow your kids to escape the consequences of their behavior at all times, as is the 21st century way, oh, sweetie, I'll fix it for you, right? And that's very much always been my instinct as well. The answer is, right, they don't understand that their behavior has consequences. And what we have built in our European allies over the 80 years since the end of World War II, and to a lesser extent, but I think still worth thinking about for our European allies, for our Asian allies, is the reality that what we conditioned in them was free riding. That not only did they think to themselves, America will pay, the answer is they thought to themselves, we can do whatever we want and America will still pay. And I got to say, I am, again, I'm not as big a fan of Donald Trump as you are, and I'm not I'm not as willing to excuse things in him that I think you have been willing to excuse and others have as well. On the other hand, sometimes mean dad is just necessary. The guy who comes in and says, I'm sorry, we're going to the police. I'm not okay that you shoplifted. I'm not okay that you smacked your friend. I'm not okay that you've been free riding at NATO for 80 years. Actually, you need to either step up or we're not going to be there for you anymore. And I think that that reckoning is just beginning. And I got to say, I'm there for it.
I'm there for it too. And you know what? Two things. One, basically what you're saying is Donald Trump looked at NATO and said, NATO is a 30-year-old kid who's still on our cell phone plan.
Exactly.
And
Exactly. Oh my God,
time to
that's
pay
so
your own cell
perfect.
phone bill. Our European allies are the 30-year-old kids still on the family cell phone plan. Exactly. Pay for your own cell phone
And
bill.
it's
So, and
bad
the
for
other thing is,
them.
it's bad. Exactly. And it's bad for us too, because NATO, our allies don't actually have to suck. Right?
Right.
They actually
Right.
could have military capabilities. They actually could have a defense industry. They actually could spend money on usable capabilities. But the only way to do that is to kick them off the cell phone plan, which is what Trump did. And good for him for doing it. And by the way, everybody in the first term of the Trump administration, when he said he was asked, will you defend NATO allies that don't meet their two? So, I mean, keep in mind, they made that 2% commitment during the Bush administration, spent 2% of GDP on defense. And when he came into office in 2016, there were 3 countries actually meeting that commitment a decade later, right? Today, every single one of them, except Canada, is meeting that. And Canada claims they will get there by April of next year, which I doubt seriously because they've got very generous GDP projections for themselves. But, okay. And now he's raised it to 5. Which is great.
And he's not raised it. He hasn't raised it to 5. And let me again, in defense of this.
Well, he's raised it to 3.5 on defense spending and 1.5 on supporting things like infrastructure and other things that have national security purposes.
That's not a grift. That is not a grift. That is a backfill.
That's not a grift.
The
It's
reality,
what they should be spending.
No, Mark, it's what backfill is, because this is what happens when you disinvest. And by the way, Pete Hegseth, lesson to you as well. It's not just about not having beards and being fat. You need to actually invest in defense. You actually need to, because otherwise, when you meet a challenge, you have a problem. And this is what the Europeans have suddenly faced up to, that Donald Trump has helped them look in the mirror and see, which is, oh, we don't have a backfill. America isn't there for us, and we've been disinvesting. We don't have airplanes. We don't have bullets. We don't have bombs. We don't have soldiers. And we don't have populations. By the way, we have not talked about this enough. We don't have populations who believe in defending our country and our values. And this is something that is a reckoning that we can thank both Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump for, because that is a conversation that has to happen in Europe.
So let me just give you some statistics to back up your point that you're 1,000% correct. So when Trump came into office, Germany, one of the wealthiest countries in Europe, was spending 1.24% of GDP on defense. It was in the bottom half of the NATO allies. And a McKinsey study found that 60% of Germany's Eurofighter and Tornado jets and 80% of its Sea Lynx helicopters were unusable. That no submarines and none of their Air Force large transport planes were available due to repairs. German soldiers didn't have enough protective vests, winter clothing, or tents to take part in NATO missions. I mean, they didn't have enough tents. How expensive are tents? Germany, this was the wealthiest country in Europe. And none of their stuff worked. That was the state of the military. And so when Trump came into office, he said, he was asked, if a NATO country isn't meeting its 2% commitment, will you defend them if they're attacked? And he said, no. And everyone said, hair on fire. Oh my God, he's destroying the security architecture that has kept Europe safe for 70 years, and the world is coming to an end and all the rest of it. And here we are, and they're finally investing in their own defense. And not only did he not destroy NATO or the security architecture, he actually is making it stronger. And that's good for America to have stronger allies. And you know what? He is right that Europe should have primary responsibility for the security of Europe. 80 years after World War II ended, that this is time for them to do it. It doesn't mean that we have to disengage, but we should be playing a support role for them. A backup role. They should have the primary responsibility. So I think it's great that he's doing that. And now the Europeans, because P.J. O'Rourke famously called them Euroweenies, in the land of the Euroweenies, the Euroweenies are still weenies. right? And so they're like, maybe we don't want to spend all this money from our taxpayers to support Ukraine, but there's this big pot of money, of Russian money, that we were afraid to take away. And now we figured out a clever way to do it, to get that money to Ukraine so that Putin can pay for it instead of the citizens of Germany and France and Belgium and other places. And I think it's great.
It is great. And we have lots of options ahead of us. Believe me, we still have tools, irons in the fire. So we should turn to our guest to talk a little bit about all of our many excellent options vis-a-vis
Sitting
the
right
Russians.
next to you because he's your husband.
Yes, he is. He is. Well, when you have a captive audience, you have a captive audience. Everybody knows my husband is Stephen Rademacher. Stephen serves as senior of counsel at Covington and Burling, helping clients navigate international policy, sanctions, and CFIUS. He has more than 20 years, God, I hesitate to say it's probably more than 30 years experience working on national security issues. He was at the White House, the State Department, the Senate, the House of Representatives. What can I say? He could never get a real job, but that's the comment from his wife. In any case, he knows where off he's
and you work for a think tank. I think he's got the real job, Danny.
Anyway, here's our interview.
Here's our interview with Stephen. Well, Stephen, welcome back to the podcast.
Great to be with you, Mark.
It's
And
great.
Danny.
It's
And
great to
Danny.
be with you. Exactly. Yes. Well, it's always good for you to be with Danny because she's your wife. But anyway, I've had this theory that ever as soon as Donald Trump told the Europeans, you've got to pay for the weapons for Ukraine, that they would suddenly discover that the Russian assets were a really good way to do that, even though they have been resisting that for 3 years. And they seem to have come up with a plan. First of all, do you agree with my assessment as to why that is happening? And two, tell us what they're doing.
Well, Mark, I guess I do have to agree with you that it's probably not coincidental that the Europeans have reconsidered whether the frozen Russian assets are a potential source of funding to help resolve the Ukraine crisis, now that they've been persuaded that the United States is not going to continue to be the source of funding to solve the problem. There's a lot of history to this issue. It goes back really to the beginning of the war, to just explain to your listeners, there's about $300 billion in frozen Russian money, mostly in Europe, but also in the United States, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, and Switzerland, some other countries. And from the very beginning, those who witnessed the incredible destruction being inflicted on Ukraine by the Russians observed that ultimately Russia is going to have to be held responsible for this damage, and it's going to have to pay reparations. And where would that money come from? And the $300 billion that had already been frozen was the most obvious source for providing that sort of compensation to the victims of Russian aggression. So this discussion has been going on since the very beginning. But there were a lot of questions about, is this permissible under international law? And even if it's permissible, will it unsettle the global financial system? Because we're talking here not about the assets of Russian oligarchs or individual Russian companies. We're talking about the assets of the Russian state. And of course, it is the Russian state that is responsible for the aggression against Ukraine, and that's why the idea of using those assets to provide compensation arose. But there are special protections under international law for sovereign assets, and there are other governments that have sovereign assets, and there's always been a concern in the banking community, and in the finance ministries of governments in Europe, Treasury Department in the United States, that governments with sovereign assets might want to take those assets somewhere that had never before confiscated those assets to compensate a victim of aggression. So these were some of the reservations that we've encountered in the past. But you're right. In the last few months,
and also
Belgium
was keeping the profits from the interest, weren't they initially? Because they're in a bank called Euroclear, which is in Belgium, which is a transfer company, and so they've been holding that, and there's been interest earning. And correct me if I'm wrong, they started out they were keeping the money, and then they got called out on that, so they said, well, we'll use it for Ukraine. And what they did was they paid themselves back for the money they were spending taking care of Ukrainian refugees. Isn't that initially how it all happened? They wanted the money.
Yes, you're basically right. And to this day, actually, you'll notice that this proposal to take the frozen Russian money in Europe And their idea now is to loan it to Ukraine. They're not going to confiscate it and give it to Ukraine. The idea the Europeans have settled on is that they're going to loan. It will remain Russian money, but their idea is they're going to loan Russia's money to Ukraine, and Russia can only get it back if they compensate Ukraine for the aggression. But there's still not yet full agreement on doing this in the European Union. The German government has come out in favor of it. The president of the European Commission has come out in favor of it. But guess what? You're right. Belgium still says this is a really bad idea. And one has to wonder whether the fact that Euroclear has had its most profitable years in history as it's pocketed the interest that it was earning on the frozen Russian money, and then the Belgian government, which was taxing those profits. I mean, they reportedly generated $4 billion in tax revenue off these frozen Russian assets. They're not that enthusiastic about loaning the money to Ukraine
grifters.
because this revenue stream will disappear.
So grifters, Mark, you really summarize this nicely. They are grifters. Just for our listeners, we have talked about this in the past. We had a podcast about this historically, but I actually want to hop into the Wayback Machine for a minute and just talk about where it was that we began, because I think it's important that people understand that not just the West, but the Biden administration and the Europeans conspired to ensure that anybody but Putin got punished financially for this. So we went after the oligarchs. And again, I get it, right? These oligarchs were, in theory, a source of leverage. They got rich because of Putin. But of course, their money wasn't Putin's money. And there was this $600 billion in foreign exchange reserves, $300 billion in Russia, and $300 billion outside Russia. Note to our Chinese friends. Just a sidebar. And what happened at the outset was that when Congress started to talk about this and ultimately acted, passing something called the Repo Act, and again, with much more Republican support, despite the bad rap on Republicans, than Democratic support, this was the idea of going after Russian sovereign assets. And no one wanted to do it, and the Biden administration wanted to do it. So, Stephen, jump a little bit for us into this Wayback Machine. And for those of you who know what that is, I'm glad you're as old as we are. But jump into this and just talk a little bit about the history of the effort to use Russian sovereign assets to support Ukraine, because of course, otherwise it's on our tax dime, right? And that's something that Donald Trump complained about. And I got to say, I don't know why we're protecting Putin's money in order to take mine and Mark's money instead. Well, Mark's money. I obviously don't care, but here we go.
So, Danny, that description you provided is essentially correct. In broad brush, this war started over 3 years ago. The idea of confiscating the Russian money and giving it to Ukraine as compensation was put forward very early on. Initially, the Biden administration hated the idea, the combination of those international law concerns and those concerns about what would the impact be on the global financial system and on foreign government deposits in the United States, led the Biden administration to be deeply skeptical about the idea. When legislation was put forward in the United States to create the legal authority for the United States, for the United States to confiscate the assets in the United States. And here we're talking about a much smaller number. It's about $5 billion in frozen Russian money in the United States. But the legal authority to confiscate that $5 billion, that was Republican legislation in Congress. It was Chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Mike McCall, was the lead sponsor in the House, and in the Senate it was Chairman Jim Risch of Idaho, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Now they both had Democratic co-sponsors, but it was a Republican initiative, and there was great resistance on the part of the Biden administration. Over time, they were worn down. Eventually, about a year and a half ago, as part of the big Ukraine supplemental appropriation that Speaker Johnson got through, the Repo Act was enacted, and the president at that point, it was President Biden at the time, was authorized to confiscate the Russian money. But the Biden administration took the position they didn't want to do it unless the Europeans were prepared to join us. And until a few weeks ago, there really was no evident willingness in Europe to do this. But for some of the reasons you suggested, Mark, the Europeans seem to be coming around. And at this point, the momentum is really building in Europe to provide the money, not in the form of a confiscated Russian asset, but rather ostensibly loaning the Russian money to Ukraine. But I think from Kyiv's point of view, the net effect will be the same. They'll get most of the frozen Russian money.
Stephen, if I can just clarify, again, we've been told for the last umpteen years that Donald Trump is a shill for Putin. Donald Trump is a friend of Putin. Donald Trump just wants Putin to win in this, or he just wants it to go away. But the Repo Act passed, notwithstanding the opposition of the Biden administration. It passed. It provided the authority for the Biden administration to actually confiscate this somewhat, $5 to $6 billion. It's not a ton of money in government terms, but it's not chump change either in Russian sovereign assets in the United States. The Biden administration didn't do that, did they?
No, as I said, they took the position that they were prepared to do it, but they weren't prepared to do it alone. They wanted the Europeans to join us in doing it. And for the duration of the Biden administration, the Europeans were not on board with this idea. Germany and France and Belgium were the big obstacles. And that's why the switch about 2 weeks ago by Chancellor Merz, where he wrote an op-ed in the Financial Times saying we should confiscate provide the Russian money to Ukraine. That was a huge switch because I think that's really the center of gravity in Europe, swinging around in favor of doing this. But it is interesting, the Trump administration position for the first 6 or 7 months of the Trump administration, there was no real indication they were interested in doing this either. I think the inflection point really was the meeting in Anchorage with President Putin, and then I think President Trump's disappointment with President Putin's failure to follow through on the commitments that President Trump thought Putin had made. And since that meeting in Alaska, the Trump administration has actually become enthusiastic about this idea as well. And the Treasury Department, Secretary Bessent has been advocating for it quite aggressively. I think where the Trump administration is coming from is they see this as sort of pressure on Putin to end the war. They calculate, I think, reasonably that President Putin probably cares about $300 billion in Russian assets, and
so weird
that he may lose this money because he's insisting on continuing to fight this war is a pressure point, and it has been an important switch by the Europeans, but also by the Trump administration. It's a much more favorable disposition than we had seen up until that meeting in August.
Well, also, since we are not providing aid to Ukraine anymore, why don't we get the money? If they loan it to Ukraine to buy weapons from us, then guess what? That money goes to create jobs for American workers. Like, why would a MAGA president not want that?
So Mark, your comment really goes to the question of, what will Ukraine do with this money once it gets it? And Chancellor Merz's proposal was to give Ukraine about $140 billion. 140 billion euros in frozen Russian assets. Most of the conversation in Europe is about spending this money for the procurement of weapons. There's some talk about using it for supporting the Ukrainian budget. Some talk about using it for reconstruction and compensation to victims. But most of the conversation is about procurement of weapons. And then, to the extent it is used to procure weapons, the question will be, are they procuring American weapons or European weapons? I'm sure you will be shocked to hear that the French position is that absolutely what they need to procure is European weapons with this money, because obviously Paris is interested in advantaging French manufacturers. I think what Ukraine needs fundamentally is American weapons. So I think if Ukraine has a voice in the matter, much of the money will actually be spent in America on the procurement of weapons here.
Well, they need Patriots and Patriot interceptors, and we're the only game in town for that.
I think there's a very important question here, which is, and in some ways, Mark, this is for us a broader umbrella, which is if countries like Russia think that their money is safe overseas, then perhaps the right message for them is actually no. If you engage in aggression, your money is not safe overseas. It was interesting to me at the beginning of this debate inside the Biden administration, their argument was, well, then everybody will stop putting their money in countries like, Germany and France and the UK and the United States, because, of course, their money will be at risk when they engage in the inevitable aggression that dictators engage in. And, of course, this was the argument that the Biden administration made. This was the argument the Biden Treasury Department made. This is still the argument that you hear from certain people in financial quarters. But, of course, Stephen, at the end of the day, what we understand and what the Europeans figured out is, so where are they going to put their money instead? I mean, help us think this through, because I think the bankers have been the biggest obstacle. It's not people like you and me and Mark, who are foreign policy nerds, who think about how Ukraine can win. It's about people who think about their money. Talk about that.
You're absolutely right, Danny. The Treasury ministries and finance ministries of various governments have voiced this concern. The answer to that concern is if you're China and you have $1 trillion, which is probably an underestimate of the resources they have on deposit around the world. Maybe you don't want to put that in a country which has confiscated Russia's assets after Russia committed an act of aggression because, hey, you're thinking about committing an act of aggression against Taiwan, and you don't want your $1 trillion to be frozen and then confiscated if you do that. But you do have a problem, which is if all of the Western countries have acted in concert, if they've all confiscated the Russian money and provided it to Ukraine, what are you left with? I mean, are you going to put $1 trillion in South Africa? Are you going to put $1 trillion in India? If basically everywhere is equally risky because everywhere in the West has a record of being prepared to provide the Russian assets to Ukraine as a consequence of Russia's aggression, then you're essentially trapped. And that was actually the Biden administration position, not at the beginning, but at the end. I think they were prepared to exercise the authority of the Repo Act, but they weren't prepared to do it alone. They wanted the Europeans to act in concert with us. And that's actually the really encouraging thing that we're watching unfold right now. The Europeans are coming around, and the Trump administration has come around, and I think the Western countries are lining up to be prepared to do this in concert. And the Chinese, the Saudis, these other countries that have a large amount of sovereign assets, they may not be thrilled about this prospect, but they really have no alternative but to leave their money where it is. And make the further point, this Russian money is frozen, and if you're Moscow, having your money frozen is almost as bad as having it confiscated. And if you're Beijing, having your money frozen is not something you could be indifferent to. And they didn't pull all their money out of the West after the money was frozen in 2022. So I don't think they're going to react more harshly if the Russian money is confiscated in 2025 or 2026. I will make one further comment, which is understanding that a consequence of naked aggression is that your foreign assets are going to be frozen and then potentially confiscated is certainly a lesson that the Chinese have drawn from this. How will we know when China has decided the time has come for them to invade Taiwan? It'll be when they pull their money out of Western banks. That'll be the canary in the coal mine.
That's very interesting. The other objection I've heard, which is related, is that the impact on the dollar. Have you heard that objection, and what do you think?
Well, that's really a related concern to this one about the impact on the global financial system. And you hear the same concern in Europe, the impact on the euro, that the euro will be less attractive as a reserve currency because they've confiscated the Russian money. And my answer, both with respect to the dollar and the euro is, if we all do this together, if Switzerland does it, if the UK does it, the EU does it, the United States does it, Japan does it, those who might want to, take their money somewhere else, they have nowhere else to go.
So Putin is not without options here. And, one of the things that we've talked about over the years. It's true, really. So one of the things that has interested us over the years, and Mark and I have actually focused on this a lot, is just how much investment there was in Russia. When there was great hope in the post-Cold War era, we all remember Bill Browder, because Bill Browder, whose grandfather, Earl Browder, had been the head of the Communist Party USA, was a huge investor in post-Soviet Russia, right? And he had something called a heritage fund. He had tons of money there. And when things started to go south in Moscow, he began to litigate against the Putin regime. He got his lawyer to represent him in Moscow to make the claim that the Russians were unfairly targeting him, that they were confiscating assets, that they were expropriating assets. And of course, that lawyer's name, that lawyer who very infamously died in prison, was Magnitsky. And the resulting legislation, the Magnitsky Act, has been extraordinarily important in going after tyrants around the world who engage in this sort of behavior. But the truth is that even after Magnitsky, we saw BP and a whole series of other companies with massive investments in Russia. Now, after Ukraine, they recognized that, perhaps this isn't the most congenial investment environment, but they were stuck between a rock and a hard place. They had invested big time. They sold some of their assets, but some of them remained there. And Stephen, you had a piece about this, just talking about what the options are. Because again, if the United States, if Europeans invest in these countries that either expropriate or use their advantages to buy foreign assets at reduced prices because the political situation has changed, what do you do? We've seen this before. So you wrote about this in the Washington Post in a piece I actually thought was very good, notwithstanding.
Thank you. That's high praise coming from you, Danny. It is true. There was a large amount of Western investment in Russia. After this war broke out in 2022, a large number of Western companies essentially pulled out. They walked away from their investments. Others sold their investment to a local partner or someone in Russia. In many cases with a contract provision allowing them to come back, buy back what they were selling. Renault sold Renault had 30% of the Russian auto market. They sold their factory outside of Moscow for 1 ruble to a Russian partner. But they have a provision in the contract that enables them in different political circumstances to come back and reclaim their ownership interest. Other Western investors have been confiscated outright. But one point that the Russians have made to try and dissuade the United States and Europe from confiscating Russia's sovereign assets is that they will confiscate the remaining Western investment in Western investment in Russia if the Western countries confiscate Russia's sovereign assets. So this is essentially threatened retaliation. And yes, there's been a lot of capital flight from Russia, but there's still plenty of Western investment there. So, this hostage, remains in Russia, and the Russians are basically threatening to kill the hostage if the U.S. and Europe proceed with confiscating the Russian sovereign assets. I don't think that is dissuading policymakers in the United States and Europe from confiscating the Russian assets for the benefit of Ukraine, because it's the right thing to do, and it's really the only source of funding to keep Ukraine afloat for the next few years. But I do think it will lead to a wave of Russian confiscations of the remaining Western investment in Russia. And the op-ed piece I wrote addressed the question of, so are we helpless in response to that, or is there some further step that the United States and European countries can take to protect themselves against this threat? And my piece pointed out that there is, in fact, a self-help remedy. And the model or the example that I pointed to was what was called the Helms-Burton Law with respect to Cuba. That was enacted in 1996 in response to a similar problem in Cuba where Fidel Castro had confiscated Western
I'm getting
investment.
90s Capitol Hill vibes, Stephen. Reminding me of the good old days when you were working in the House Foreign Affairs Committee and Danny and I were working in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and we were putting the screws on Fidel Castro.
Well, so I mean, you've broken the code. I enjoyed writing that piece because it did bring back good memories, and I think we did good work in the 1990s. We wrote a law, and you were involved in it. I was involved in it. Danny was involved in it, that enabled the Americans whose property in Cuba had been confiscated by the Castro regime and then subsequently resold to some other investor. And in the case of Cuba, these other investors tended to be Canadian or Western European, and they were coming in and they were buying, at a deep discount what were formerly American properties. And for some reason they were prepared to believe that Castro would confiscate them from Americans, but would never dream of confiscating them from these new investors. I guess that was a risk they were prepared to run. But the idea of the legislation was to enable the Americans who had lost their property to sue these new investors if they could gain jurisdiction over them in a U.S. court, sue them for damages, essentially the value of the confiscated property. Treble damages, 3 times the value. So that was to deter the confiscation and then the transfer to new investors of the properties. And the point of my op-ed was to say, hey, we've already faced, the reports are that already Putin has confiscated about $50 billion in investment in Russia. He's on the cusp of probably confiscating a lot more. And the point of my op-ed was to say, the Helms-Burton law is a model. We can enable those Western investors whose investments in Russia are illegally confiscated. I mean, that's key. It's illegal under international law to confiscate property of foreign investors without providing compensation. Castro didn't provide compensation in the case of Cuba, and Putin is not providing compensation when he confiscates Western investment in Russia. So it's illegal confiscation under international law, and the investors whose property is confiscated illegally would be able to sue the new investors if they could gain jurisdiction over them. And now, in many cases, let's be clear, it's not going to be possible to gain jurisdiction over the new investors. But in some cases, it will be possible. In some cases in Cuba, it was possible. And there's a large class of potential investors in these properties in Russia who I think will decide they're not interested in investing if they might be sued. I mean, Russian oligarchs who have an important footprint in Europe or elsewhere in the West, they will suddenly lose interest in coming in and buying discounted, confiscated properties in Russia because they would be sued in Western courts if they did that. Chinese companies that have operations outside of China are not going to want to expose themselves to the risk of lawsuits by coming into Russia and buying these properties. So these will essentially become contraband properties. I mean, it's a reduced universe of potential investors. So the value of these properties will be diminished. The amount of money that Putin can hope to generate to continue his war by confiscating these properties will be diminished because they will be less desirable. And in some cases, the confiscated Western investors will be able to win compensation for their losses. So that was the idea I put forward, that in the U.S. and Europe, all of the countries whose investors might be victimized here should enact versions of the Helms-Burton law directed against Russia to enable their expropriated investors to sue the traffickers in their property.
So you left out the most important part of Helms-Burton, which is it harnessed the power of the angry wife and daughter, because in addition to the lawsuits, it declared any senior executive of the companies trafficking in the expropriated properties persona non grata in the United States, and their wives and their children. And so all of a sudden, these executives had their wives who wanted to go shopping on Fifth Avenue or wanted to go stay in their Miami condo, or their daughter wanted to go to Harvard, and suddenly they were not allowed in the United States, and they were like saying, sorry, sweetie, you can't go to Disneyland this summer, or can't go to camp in the United States or whatever the heck they were doing, and their families started yelling at them, like, what the hell are you doing? So that was even more powerful than the threat of the lawsuits in terms of deterring this investment. Am I wrong?
Yeah, well, that was an important feature of Helms. That was a separate provision in Helms-Burton, and for the first 23,
we should apply that one here too.
For the first 23 years of Helms-Burton, that was the most important feature because there was a provision that enabled the president to suspend the right to sue. And for the first 23 years after that law was enacted, every president from Clinton through Donald Trump suspended the right to sue. It was only Donald Trump who allowed the first lawsuits to be brought under Helms-Burton. But now that precedent has been set, I think both the visa denial provision and the risk of lawsuits will be important deterrents to confiscation of Western investment in Russia.
So, exit question from me. Again, I think there's been a lot of sort of boring, Atlantic magazine, conventional wisdom, nastiness about the Trump administration's policy on Russia. And Mark and I have both been critical when the president has been tolerant of Putin's dilatory tactics, of Putin's unwillingness to meet his commitments. At the same time, we've recently approved the sale of TLAMs to Ukraine. The White House is approving intel that is being provided to the Ukrainians for deep strikes into Russia, which were never approved under the Biden administration, one of the big restrictions of the Biden administration. So I guess, as I watch the noose being tightened, you're talking about basically driving away foreign investors from Russia who have been instrumental in the Russian economy. I know that, we've been talking, and the president has been talking about limiting Russia's ability to sell oil, which is the only thing that sustains the Russian economy at this point, and was a deal that the Biden administration put in place disgracefully in order to prop up his own political fortunes. It's true, the Ukrainians aren't winning, but the Russians aren't winning either. And the noose is being tightened on the Russians, not the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are getting better weapons, better intel, more support from NATO, more support from Europe. And yeah, the Russians are lashing out, right? We're seeing them now trying to interfere at Western airports, trying to interfere with drones in NATO territory. I know this isn't a fair question, but it's an honest one at least. What happens? I don't think Putin says uncle. And I want to know what you think too, Mark, here, because this is actually a question that I think we're all asking ourselves. What do you think, Stephen?
Personally, I don't think Putin has accepted mentally the idea that he's not going to win this war. I think when he's making small but incremental progress on the battlefield at enormous cost to Russia, but he thinks that cost is sustainable. When Donald Trump was elected, I think he believed that he had a counterpart in Washington who was prepared to look the other way and let him get away with his aggression. I think he's beginning to have to reassess that judgment. If these weapons transfers that you were talking about, the Tomahawk missiles in particular, if the United States follows through with the delivery of those systems, I do think that will begin to turn the tide of battle in Ukraine. But I don't think Putin is there yet. I think he still believes he can win this war. And so what fundamentally has to happen is that mindset has to be changed. I mean, through a combination of sanctions, which shows him that the Russian economy is going to slowly be strangled, through developments on the battlefield that persuade him that there is no military victory that he can grasp. Maybe he will come around. I think President Trump thinks that ultimately Putin will agree, but I think he has come to recognize that additional pressure needs to be brought to bear in order to get us to that point. So I think we're beginning to see the application of that pressure, and hopefully it is enough. But, if it's not enough, I think the other scenario for ending this war is that others in Russia come to recognize that this has been a colossal mistake made by their current leadership. And, at some level, at some time, there's a reaction, whether it's, people in the streets overthrowing the government, or the military overthrowing the government, or a single individual who comes and decides to make a change in the leadership of his country through an assassination. I don't know, but I think it's one of those two scenarios that ultimately ends the war.
What do you think, Mark?
Well, so I think the Tomahawks, if they actually happen, and they happen in a vigorous way, could be the game changer that forces Putin to the table, because One of the things that Putin is counting on, and Stephen and I have discussed this, is that he thinks that Trump is trying to get a trade deal with China, and China is the number one purchaser of Russian oil, and that Trump is not going to sacrifice his trading relationship and his chance for getting a trade deal with China for Ukraine. And so Trump is reluctant to impose secondary sanctions on China. There's two ways to attack the Russian ability to export fossil fuels. One is to do the secondary sanctions. The other is to send missiles to destroy the facility so they can't export them. There's the receiving end and there's the exporting end. And so if Ukraine were to suddenly have the ability to strike deep into Russia with a much bigger payload, and not just taking out the refineries that are close to Ukraine with drones, but actually start hitting their natural gas facilities that are 1,500 kilometers from Ukraine, and some of these other facilities. I think that would be a come to Jesus moment for Putin, and it also might create the kind of pressure on Putin from within. Especially you start striking at some of the economic targets that some of these Putin supporters, oligarch supporters, have. I think that could be there could be pressure to either negotiate or maybe something else. The Steve Rademacher solution could be executed. So I think this is the Tomahawks are both a military and an economic tool.
Amen. Let us see this happen. I cannot wait to watch this squeeze and see whether Putin wakes up and smells the coffee, or someone else in Russia wakes up and smells the coffee. That would be the ideal outcome.
Smell the vodka.
Vodka infamously has no smell, so that's one of the reasons why it's so popular. But
it does on your breath.
Pro tips from Danny and Mark about how to drink discreetly. Stephen, thank you. Thank you, as always, for joining us.
The country that invented vodka.
There you go, Mr. Potato Head. Thank you very much. Stephen, thank you for joining us, for being patient and explaining this, and for the great ideas. I hope we see Helms-Burton Mark II for Russia, because it could be the beginning of a great new trend.
Amen. And Stephen's always patient because he's your husband.
Hey, I resemble that comment. All right. Anyway, thanks again.
It was a pleasure, guys. Thank you.
Take care. All right, Danny. So how did Stephen do?
No, he did great. He's generally speaking, imaginative and not too difficult of a spouse. But the conversation
he's the best international lawyer in Washington.
Well, you can say that. I could hardly comment.
Well, you might think so, but I could hardly comment.
And folks, that was a bastardization of a terrific TV show. So for he who knows, put that in the comments to us. But seriously, Mark, I think the conversation really underscored something to me that we have not talked about enough, but that is something that our colleagues at AEI work on a lot. Our colleague Derek Scissors, our colleague Dan Blumenthal, but a lot of others as well. And Derek, obviously, is Washington's foremost China economist. Dan Blumenthal is one of the best Asia people in town. And one of the things this underscores to us is the importance, actually, of segregating out our economy from bad guys. During the Cold War, there was just no confusion. We had a system called COCOM. We sold weapons to good guys, but our trading system favored good guys. Our trading system favored countries we could trust. Our trading system favored allies who were with us in global efforts, not just on economic prosperity, but also on national security. And again, our relationship with China has been transformative. It's been transformative for China. It's been transformative for the world. I love the cheap crap I buy on Amazon. But at the end of the day, what's happening with Russia and this talk about money is a reminder to us that actually, when we help underwrite the economies of our enemies, they use that money to harm Americans and American values and American interests.
Exactly.
And we need to be working harder on this.
I agree with you 1,000%. And you've touched on one of my biggest things that I'm angry about national security policy in the 21st century. So first of all, when Donald Trump left office 4 years ago, world was largely at peace, and China and Russia had not entered into this new alliance that they have at that.
With
And
Iran
over the
and North
4 years
Korea.
with Iran and North Korea. And all of a sudden, when he came back, and he inherited a world on fire, and he inherited a world in which all the rogue states had come together in Dr. Evil's lair and formed an alliance to against us. And so he's dealing with a problem that was created under the Biden administration that he's trying to disentangle and deal with. But the problem is much deeper than that. You and I were on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the 90s working for Jesse Helms, who was warning, like Cassandra, do not let the Chinese into the WTO. Do not give them permanent normal trade relations. This is a bad, bad idea. And everybody said, "Oh no, you're wrong, Senator Helms. If we open up trade, then China will join the rules-based international system, and they will have an incentive to follow the rules. And trade will democratize them and make them less repressive, because you can't have a repressive free market economy. You need free information and all the rest of it. And American businesses will go in, and they'll be a force for good in the country, and all these wonderful things will happen." Well, here we are a quarter century later, and that decision, I think, will go down as the most catastrophic national security decision the United States has made in this century, because everything has happened in the opposite way. China is more repressive than it was before. It's gone from being authoritarian back to totalitarian. The trade and investment from the United States has fueled the rise of the Chinese economy, which has fueled the rise of the Chinese military, which is now out investing us and has hundreds of shipyards where we can barely get together a handful of them to build ships. So we're building up the Chinese military through our investment that is going to attack us one day. The American businesses who are investing there have become foreign agents of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's not an exaggeration. That literally, when Congress was considering legislation, something so simple and obvious, to ban Uyghur slave labor, products made with Uyghur slave labor. You know who was lobbying on Capitol Hill? It wasn't the Chinese embassy. It was Nike. It was all these American companies that were doing business over there. On every level, it's either failed or backfired and produced the opposite of result of what we intended. So I think this is the problem we face now is that disentangling, it's like a tumor that has enveloped a healthy organ, right? And how do you disentangle that without killing the healthy organ, right? Which is the US economy. And we've got to figure out, everybody woke up to this problem in COVID, because we discovered, oh my God, we're dependent on China for pharmaceuticals. What else are we dependent on China for? Well, it turns out we're dependent on China for shipping cranes, because our shipping crane industry died because we built them all in China. And they put radios on all of the shipping cranes so that are controlled from Beijing. So in a conflict, they could shut down all of our ports. And then we just found out that in the UN, that they had infiltrated New York's cell phone networks and had a system where they could absolutely bring down communications in New York. And how many places and how many other things have they done like that, where we've become dependent on them, or we've allowed them to infiltrate? They're buying farmland. They're doing all sorts of things to harm us, and we don't even know the half of it. And so, I think this is going to go down in history as one of the most tragic decisions we made. And we've got to start. I'm not a fan of industrial policy from an economic standpoint, but I've said this before. The big mistake we made during COVID is we put virologists in charge of the economy, right? The big mistake we made in the last quarter century when it comes to national security is we put economists in charge of national security policy. And
Amen.
Some things don't make economic sense. They're not what Milton Friedman would tell us is the best way to produce prosperity for the American people. But you know what? Maybe if China wants to make my T-shirts, God bless them. I don't want them making my pharmaceuticals. I don't want them making things that can strangle our economy and hurt us in a conflict. Like, we had Mike Gallagher on the podcast. We're dependent on China for energetics for our missiles. I mean, think about that. We are dependent on China to give us the stuff that we put in the missiles that we will have to launch against them if they ever try to start a war invasion of of Taiwan. Why would we do that? Who the hell came up with this idea? So, we need a very skilled surgeon to go in and disentangle this, cut this tumor off, because we're in a world of hurt.
Right. And and Russia is the lesson for us, right? Because let me just say, Russia is no China. Russia's not producing much that we want. And yet we've had years of effort, and naked Russian aggression. And yet we have not had the will to do what is necessary to disentangle ourselves and our European allies from the Russian economy. So this is the lesson to us. And I just hope we take it. Hey, folks, thanks for being with us. Let us know if you have any questions.
See you next week.
Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.